Hello, everyone. So we have several things today. We have the retrospective we want to do. Lynn can talk about her Service Mesh Con talk. Service Mesh is still hard, which should be very interesting to everyone and to the user experience. John has a short thing on validation, webhook warning, and the possibility of doing more in the webhook. We also have two others that might slip. Reorganizing the Istio color commands and XDS event organization. Are we happy with this order and then just ending at the top of the hour, or do we want to reorder anything here?
Looks good to me.
Excellent. So what we do every release is everyone edits this document for 10 or 15 minutes on mute, and then we go back and read what we thought were the conclusions of this document. I've put a link to this in the Slack. I would say we should spend the next 10 or 15 minutes until people slow down, just sort of entering this, and we can see what we thought about our last release. How does that sound? Begin now, please. Are we ready to discuss? Okay, so after we type these, we try to say them out loud. The first shout out is for me, but I don't want to say it myself. Can the people who wrote these not say them?
Yeah, I'll read that out. Ed, you pushed through all kinds of ambiguity and disagreement to get us an actual concrete implementation of XDS-based debugging in 1.7, which was quite the hat trick.
Thanks, and I want to thank Costin for having XDS events at all. Who wrote the next one?
Yeah, I wrote the next one. Basically, Clay proposed the analysis API earlier this year, and Mitch helped push that into API repo. I did some final work, so it's a collaboration on the people in this working group.
Excellent. And I don't know if Zenon is here, but I was so happy to get Istio Cuddle uninstall in at the very end. What went well?
Wrote the first one. So we had several interns, at least two, who worked on UX features for in the past few months, and some of them also expressed interest in continuing working on in this, at least in Istio. So yeah, that was a kind of a good effort.
Right on. Next. Mitch, was that you? Disagreements?
Sorry, yeah, it was nice not to have as much conversation happening in the pull request, as much uncertainty after the work was committed. It was unfortunate how much friction we did experience in trying to get troubleshooting done, but it was nice that that friction happened in the context of design docs before all the work to implement had been done. And yeah, Istio Cuddle test coverage is getting better release over release, so that I think we should be seeing fewer and fewer backwards compatibility breaks. Oh, that's also me. Sorry, I put all of mine in a row. Uh, the VM stabilization feature really took usability into consideration, and I saw several other areas, other working groups, very actively considering usability before pushing their features out in a way that I haven't seen in previous releases. So that was really nice.
I wrote my first documentation test. I didn't want to shout out to Frank because he's not in our group, but that framework worked well, and I think it's going to be a good place to put tests in addition to the integration area. Okay, the next topic is what could have gone better, and I'll complain about lots of difficulties reaching consensus with networking around security and XDS, which prevented us from delivering experimental weight in 1.7. We're still using the legacy weight. We also did not socialize or implement the idea of what it means when we're done with the canary release. There's an issue for that for 1.8. I think we're going to move forward on it this time, but that was a big frustration. And the last topic is what should we completely stop?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Ed, we had some friction around XDS eventing. In particular, several of the things that we were told it would support, it did not support by the end of the release, which caused us to slip several features. So I think the moral of the story in 1.8 is when we have dependencies on other networking groups, or sorry, other working groups, we actively drive those dependencies and implement them if necessary.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for participating in the retrospective. The next item is Lynn. Lynn, can you share the screen for this?
Yes. Thank you, Ed.
So I did not attend Service Mesh Con this year, but I'm interested in what Lynn said were the problems and also what the attendees told her during the Q&A.
Yeah, so I will try to run this a little bit quicker just for the content relevant for this team. Certainly, Service Mesh Con, you guys probably know it's a paid conference. So the slides and the video should be out in early September, which is now actually. So maybe in a week or two. This is actually the first talk we actually had do it with Boy. And so Istio, we never had any talk with anybody from LinkedIn in the past. So this is like the first historical joint talk. So one thing I want to mention quickly for this talk, we are mostly focused on service mesh trade-off, how people are using service mesh and what are the pain points for service mesh. And the talk was mostly focusing on the complexity of the service mesh, not so much focusing on how much CPU and memory we're consuming, not so much focusing on latency, because we believe the machine could work harder, but the complexity for people to wrangle the mesh, to be able to adapt and learn the mesh is like the biggest thing from the user. So that's what this talk mostly focusing on. It's about the user's human cost. And who pays the cost? Some of you probably read my most recent blog on external Istio external control plane. Some of the personnel, we believe that's really important to the service mesh domain is the platform owner, which are the team who owns service mesh, and they set like the strategy for the service owner to adopt service mesh. And the developers are whoever owns individual services that's going to run in the mesh. And external Istio is introduce additional role for people who providing Istio as a service, which is why we added like mesh operator role, who is in charge of installing and upgrading control plane. So I'm not going to go through like LinkedIn examples because I thought their example was pretty boring. Basically, they talk about like how do you do zero configuration and how much changes from 1.0 to 2.0 basically is doing nothing. How they have like dashboards built-in support in LinkedIn 2.0, and they didn't have much building in one, and then this is their dashboard, which I think we pretty much do everything they have. For the Istio example, I was scratching a lot of my head when I tried to build the slides, because I actually think Istio improves a lot since I started working on Istio like 3 years ago. It's actually a lot easier to use now. I was giving example of the concepts are a little bit harder for user to learn. I think not just because of the concept itself, it's also about the interaction of the concept. Like in this case, I was giving an example of consumer and producer side. Using on the producer side, if you're actually using external services, you have to worry about all these concepts, and also most importantly, you have to worry about how these concepts connect to each other. And then on top of that, you have to worry about how you are actually scoping your resources through export to and sidecar. So these are not small concepts that user have to learn and get through the learning curve. And then if the service A happens to also expose on the gateway, then they have to also learn a bunch of concepts related to that too. I gave a shout out that our team actually did a really good job to help maintain the boundary of the platform service team and the service owner team, which is the developer and who operating their services in the mesh by using virtual service delegation. So that's a new feature that we introduced recently that allows the platform owner to be able to delegate certain configurations to individual teams through virtual service delegation. And then I talk about how I had a hard time with the TCP and the host. So this is interesting. So John, I think you know my story. I had a real hard time when I was working on external Istio that it's not obvious to me that when you're using TCP, even though we allow hosts in the gateway resource, but when TCP is used, the hosts are not really being used. So I had a simple virtual service and gateway resource like this, and I find out that it didn't work at all. And it turned out because I was using the TCP protocol and the host wasn't really applied when TCP is used, but we didn't have any errors. So it took me a while to figure this out. And I think I asked John and Frank, multiple users, to kind of figure out what's going on. So when you find a bug, that's when service mesh is really, really hard for me. For Istio, it's like when you find a bug and nobody tells you what's wrong, that's when you have to kind of looking at the code and the bug of the maintainers on the project. Like in my case, I actually find a bug with SNI host-based routing, and I work with John very closely to actually fix this in 1.7. But as a user who stumbled onto trying to do this simple scenario, I mean, the YAML was perfect. It just nothing works. It's actually a much bigger learning curve to figure out what is exactly going on and even propose a fix. The other thing I sort of share was the story. Some of you would know that I wrote a book about Istio Explained last year. And as part of the book, it was like a really 3 services and consume external services. So it was really simple. So the whole thing we were trying to do is teaching people how Istio can be simple, right? So we added sidecar proxy to each of the services, and we tighten up the security. And then we actually find out, the first thing we find out, the health check was not working the moment we tighten up security. I think this is fixed now with the HTTP Pro. But back then, when this wasn't fixed, it was really hard for the user because all the services went down the moment you enable mutual TLS. The other thing I find out is because my services was already communicate using HTTPS, so I find out if I do like header-based routing on some of my services, it doesn't work because the traffic was encrypted. So I had to modify the code to kind of downgrade to using HTTP to communicate with the other services. So that took me a while to figure out because it wasn't obvious because a lot of our documentation was more telling people, hey, if you need to move your services to the mesh, you need to make sure your deployment YAML, you need to make sure your service YAML, fits. We have like a deployment and services page, but not so much about when you need to fully leverage your mesh, you have to make sure, the traffics are plain traffic among your services so that you can do header-based routing when we can actually interpret the requests. So I think this is the key thing. So the one I was mentioned earlier was more setting the stage. This is the key thing that we want to say, how do we actually make service mesh boring that we don't have to talk about it? Because now every single conference with every single, different user groups, there's always a lot of hypes about service mesh. And also part of the reason it was hard when people try stuff. So what I find out was Buoyant actually has a really interesting survey on their website where they actually asking user to figure out how many people are in your engineering org and how many services do you have in your application. And it's an interesting survey to guide the user whether they actually need to use in service mesh. So I was thinking, what if we can actually provide an interesting tool based on where we are with our mesh to help user analyze if we know that it's kind of like our analyze tool, but maybe expand the purpose. By the way, I didn't use Istio because the talk was generic to service mesh, so I didn't want to just using Istio here. But the thoughts is about using a specific service mesh CLI to be able to analyze based on user scope. So the user could say, analyze this particular namespace, or maybe analyze a combination of a few namespaces, and then give us like a recommendation of, whether service mesh would be good to have. Like in our book, when I go through all these three services were in the trade namespaces, and in fact, they were using the same language. So if it's not right in the book for the purpose of tutorial teaching other people, it's probably not worth effort to do service mesh, given all the services are using Java. So that's an interesting thought. And and in fact, we got a lot of users asking us about, is this something, the Linkd or Istio are willing to provide guidance to the user to help user decide. So this is just another example of maybe you have a little bit more service and people are using different languages in your services. The other thing I come to the conclusion is zero configuration may be possible, especially with our protocol detection stuff. However, it's great for onboarding. A lot of the time, we do recommend people to declare protocol in production for security and also for performance reasons. And we think it would be really interesting to kind of provide as part of the analyze service, even though in this example, this particular service may be using automatically protocol deduction to detect it's using HTTP, but it would actually be able to recommend people, hey, it would be a good practice to manually detect the protocol to kind of give user alert, even though our automatic protocol detection could help user to onboarding. Zero code change, I find out it's actually not possible. Most likely, I think the main hurdle is, can your other headers propagated? Can you actually run your services with sidecar? Also, are your services doing retry and timeout and secure communication yourself? Because if you are going to leverage the mesh to do it, it's best to actually have these disabled in your code so that you would avoid a lot of surprises. Like I mentioned earlier, I was doing secure communications in my own services. And then the moment I add head-based routing, it was just not working. So those are the examples that in order to fully leverage the mesh, sometimes you do need to disable these functionalities and rely on the mesh to provide these functionalities to you. And the other thing interesting I thought it would be, you know what's going on with your own service if you actually develop the service, but a lot of times you might be using images from other people, maybe in Docker Hub or some other repository. Now the questions comes also, can you actually run the container image in the mesh? Can you is the container be able to fully leverage the mesh? So there could be certain levels of how compatible they are with the service mesh. And one example I knew was last Thanksgiving, I was helping a user debugging a problem that the moment they put a sidecar onto Zookeeper, and then they find out the leader election of Zookeeper complete broke, and their Zookeeper just keep doing reboot for like you see in this instances for crash loop back off for their pods. So this is an example of some of the container image out there. If you throw a sidecar, it may not even work at all. So it would be like completely function broken for this application. The other thing we talk about is metrics. As part of service mesh, it's really cool. Like in Istio, I can, if I know which application I like, for instance, booking for, I want to gain visibility. I mean, I can have all that visibility I want, but it's actually pretty hard if you want to do it at the mesh level. So like if you want to look at your region to be able to look at what's going on at a higher level, sort of like you know what you are looking for, that's actually hard right now with what we provide. So I think these are just different thoughts on how we can make service mesh more easier. Most importantly, I think to me, I feel like the most hard portion is not only the service mesh framework itself, like Istio. It's really about dealing with different type of applications and whether it's worth the effort to move to the mesh or whether the application has been running successfully with sidecar or whether the application has been successfully enabled fully for service mesh. Those are the harder things beyond just the basic service mesh framework itself.
So I think this is a great presentation, Lynn. I myself have wondered about, a tool that would analyze your current usage before Istio and then apply it and generate some recommendations. So it might be valuable for this group or other groups to come up with some proposals. When I am trying to apply Istio manually, I created the add to mesh command, and then I will add one pod at a time to see when it starts breaking. It would be very easy to automate those that I do manually to do that and to sort of incorporate Wireshark and sniff the traffic and incorporate chaos engineering and see how much reliability is already built into the pods. It's an ambitious project to make a mesh analyzer, but I think it would be so awesome.
Yeah, I know. I think maybe we could potentially start small, like for some of the application and services, we know they already have a problem. Like we've done a lot of study with like Redis, Zookeeper, and some of the other things. Maybe we could, if we can just present what we know for the user, because I can't remember how many times people ask me about Redis and some of these applications. I have to dig through our Istio.io or discuss to find out for people, so we can present them using the analyzer. Even though we can't do like 100%, if we can do a reasonable starting percentage and gradually grow, I think it would be super helpful too.
There's an issue that we have where I keep a list of every application people claim doesn't work with Istio, and this issue lists all of the middleware and then links to all of the user reports about that, which would be a good start for knowing what people are commonly complaining about. I will put a link to that in the meeting notes later, because that is, I would love people who are seeing problems with a particular piece of middleware to extend that issue by editing the description to include the other problems.
Yeah, question
that
for you
sounds-
guys. in a hypothetical world where Istio is perfect, is there such a need for this thing, or do you just, Istio is transparent, you just put the sidecar everywhere, things magically work? Like, is this working around bugs, or is this an inherent service mesh thing that is needed?
So to work. So first, just like we have auto detect, we need to auto get out of the way if the pod is already doing all this stuff. And second, we
I don't know if I agree with that statement.
okay.
If I get you off there.
But,
Like, there's no way the pod is reporting Istio metrics, right?
that's true. But what I found is people are using, some Java library that's already doing TLS and it's already prerecking TLS 1.3 and it's managing all the stuff itself. Then Istio comes in and ruins things because it doesn't know how to get out of the way of that. So we want Istio to get out of the way, back off to TCP or something to get metrics. But we also want, before you apply Istio, a way of saying, well, adding Istio is not going to give you reliability or virtual service stuff because you're already doing ad hoc TLS and reliability yourself. Or we're going to give you a lot. Or we know that this is a particular piece of middleware and here's the settings to make it work better with Istio.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that, in my opinion, though, like the only reason that we should not have a sidecar is for high performance cases where you really need to squeeze things out. Just because your application is doing TLS or it has, you have some library that does reliability and maybe you have good metrics, doesn't mean that Istio doesn't still provide value, right? Now we do a bad job in some places like Zookeeper where we break things. So, but this is, assuming we fix those cases. But I do think you're right. Like, it would be useful to say, hey, this service is already sending TLS, so you can't use, all these other features. So, go change XYZ if you want to use those, but not to say, don't bother injecting, a sidecar.
Yeah, it's more about alerting people based on the state of the mesh today. Certainly, John, like you said, I mean, if everything works perfect, we don't need to warn anybody. It's more about, okay, for this given version of Istio, if we run the analyze, it would reporting people on this problem based on, what they wanted to add to the mesh or based on the fact they already added to the mesh. Because I think the cost of finding the problem and finding a resolution is super high within Istio. That's the biggest thing, is we help people connect the dots based on the knowledge we already knew.
Sometimes new features eliminate this problem. So I'm very excited that in 1.8 we're going to put on the new 1.7 feature of delaying the pod until the sidecar is running.
Oh, right.
That's gonna solve so many problems, and making it automatic is going to solve so many problems. So of course, one of the reasons we never put the work into analyzing that automatically and warning people is that it's so much better just to do what we actually did do and solve it. But it would be good to know, sort of, to make it easier for us to know which features of Istio people are still having trouble with. I feel that feature is going to automatically make so many more applications just work with Istio. But it would be good to quantify what Istio should do to reach perfect transparency.
Yeah. So how about this? Maybe we can take this offline in a document. What are the things we could potentially realize through tooling based on where Istio is today? And maybe where Istio could be in the next release or two.
I would be happy to work with you on that, Lynn. My manager and I have been talking about this for years.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. And if anybody else is interested, just let me know. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you for presenting. This is great, Lynn. Howard, John, do you want to talk about validation webhook warning?
Yeah, so basically, short summary is Kubernetes added this new feature for warnings on webhooks. So for today, we could say either this config item is good or this config item is bad and reject it. Now we can give them a warning and say, you're doing something we don't recommend, but we're not going to actually block the config from being created. So I think this is super useful. We can add a lot of stuff there. So this doc is basically, I was trying to get a list of things we want to add warnings for. Right now, I just have a small list because I didn't think that hard about it. But we can expand it, and then we just need to do some fairly small amount of work to, refactor things so we can plumb these warnings through, I think. And that's pretty much it.
These warnings the user gets these warnings as soon as they apply config. Like, so if they apply like a virtual resource that's referring to a gateway that doesn't exist, they would immediately get a warning.
Yeah, so two things. My understanding of this, which is based on reading the docs, not trying it myself, is you do like kubectl apply some config, and it'll say created virtual service warning. This references something bad. So that's what the user experience will be there.
Yeah, that
amazing.
actually is possible in validation. So in validation, we're only able to validate the resource that comes in, not any resources it refers to. Any referential sort of validation has to be done in analyzers.
Yeah, actually, that was a good point, Mitch. I generally agree with you, but I was thinking of it this morning, actually. Part of the reason why we can't do it is because like the validation has to be stateless, right? But a warning doesn't necessarily need to be, right? We could technically warn on cross-resource stuff, I think.
That's interesting. I'll have to give that some thought.
Yeah, so I don't know off the bat if it's a good idea. We should probably ask Kubernetes what they think as well. But it seems like it might be possible.
The validate function is on per resource, right?
It is.
It's just the implementation, right? We can change that if we need to.
Well, so that creates kind of dependency when you have the webhook. So I'm not sure if that's a good idea on our implementation side, because if you look at Analyzer today, it actually runs sometime when you have actually a bunch of resources that you look at.
Oh, you mean it's slow?
So yeah, it's kind of slow. So I don't think we would probably want that. Kind of it creates dependency in the
certainly. Yeah.
I can
probably in the first iteration we won't do that, but in theory in the future maybe we could.
I can think of some warnings that are single item warnings that I would love to put in this way. Which reminds me, I have a pull request waiting for approval. Analyze duplicate virtual service matches, and it has these infos that could easily become warnings when the resource is applied. So I might want to try to use that feature with this to see if it happens. Also looking for people in this work group to review this item. Thank you. Was that everything about the webhook?
Yeah, I also just, for you, I know you've looked at Envoy filters a lot. I think there's a lot of things in Envoy filter that are probably like warning type things that maybe don't make sense to be errors, so that could help there as well. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And I don't want to do this, so if someone wants to actually do the implementation, that would be amazing.
Also for the support, I think you mentioned this is a new feature in 1.19. So I know we our support of 1.19 is minimum is 1.8, right?
Yeah, so I suspect, and I have not verified that at all, that if we implement this and you're using an older Kubernetes version or older kubectl, it will just ignore it. We have to verify that. If that's the case, then great. We just implement it, and then once people are on newer versions, they get these warnings for free. If not, then we need to do something.
Okay, because I think you also mentioned the CRD deprecation warning. That is, I don't think it will be supported if user use a Kubernetes version lower than 1.19. Because that's a field on CRD, so it will be rejected.
Yeah, I don't really care about that one that much. I agree. You're probably right. We probably can't use that, and I don't really care that we can't use it because I don't think it's that useful for us, really. Until we actually have legitimate differences in the versions, I don't really care if they're using the old version or not. Right? It's just kind of adding churn for them. So, yeah, it's good to know that we have it there for the future, but for now we can put it off.
Is there a bug tracking this? Or if not create, I can create one just to track it. It doesn't have to be this release if we don't have time, but yeah, we'll do that at later
I think I made a
release.
bug, so you can make one.
Okay. Yeah, I will do that.
How long is it going to take us XDS event aggregation? We have 12 minutes.
I don't. We can at least start it in that time. It depends on how many questions we have.
So I don't think we have time to do the persona role reorganization. So let's start XDS aggregation.
Sounds good. So to be clear, this design doc is not ready for approval, but I kind of want to keep everyone in the loop as far as this design evolves. If you remember in 1.7, originally when we started using XDS events, we were told that we would be given one XDS channel that would have events for the entire control plane. And that did not happen due to some technological constraints and some time constraints on 1.7. So Austin has asked that we take the lead in implementing this in 1.8. And so this is my first attempt at a design for that. In particular, what we'd like to do is use the Cloud Events API, which is a CNCF technology that is message bus agnostic in order to share data between instances of Istio. The way that this would work is we'd have a message bus, for instance, NATS, that all instances of Istio could talk to via Cloud Events. And they would share information that way. And then when you're running in IBM, if their central Istio wanted to use, I don't know, AMQP or their own pub sub implementation, as long as it's Cloud Events compatible, it's really more or less a configuration change along with implementing something to set up the message bus itself and authenticate. But all of our interactions with the message bus should be generic enough that you can do it with just about any implementation. Does everyone follow so far? All right, I'll take that as a yes. One of the other objectives is we would like this to be as simple as possible from an orchestration perspective. And you all are familiar with the work that's happened in the last year to centralize all of our operations into Istio so that our users aren't having to run 9 different, I don't think it was ever quite 9, but many services, each of which has its own logs and its own problems and its own configuration. So we'd like to try and continue that and make it so that users don't have to maintain a separate message bus deployment alongside of Istio in open source. Again, for cloud providers, I imagine they'll want to bring their own. Like Google has, I think we call it Cloud Pub Sub or whatever. So it's less of an issue for central Istio patterns and managed Istio patterns than it is for users who are using pure open source technology. So to that end, I looked around at the message buses that implement the Cloud Events API, and I found that NATS is the only one that is written in Golang. That has the advantage that we can actually run it inside the Istio process itself to, again, minimize the number of things that our customers need to spin up. So my proposal is that in open source, we use NATS to implement the Cloud Events API, that we share data between Istio instances using these Cloud Events, that will enable things like our central Istio debugging that we've been trying to get unblocked. Our debug API will work that way. Costin also mentioned that networking has a few features that they would like to leverage this as well. So they would be able to build on top of this in addition. Trying to think if there's other details.
I thought the whole point of Cloud Events is that it's a generic API, and we just implement the API, and then they can plug in whatever they want. Why do we need to invent NATS?
So we don't need to invent NATS. You're right that Cloud Events is an API, but in open source, if we're going to leverage that API, we need to have an implementation, right? There needs to be some message bus behind those calls. So this would support users.
Well, we don't need
if they were interested.
We don't need one necessarily, right? We don't provide our own Prometheus or our own Grafana or Jaeger, right? We have integrations.
That is true, and this would be another possible integration. However, in talking with people in the environments working group and as well with Costin, there was very little interest in having this be another component that users have to orchestrate alongside Istio.
So just went through like a whole year of trying to remove all these add-ons that we bundle with Istio. So now we're going the exact opposite direction.
Well, no, this would not be the same as bundling. This would not be us setting up a deployment for NATs, right? This happens all within the Istio-D deployment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I don't see why. Like I don't think we want to take a dependency on NATs, right? Like I don't think IBM's going to use NATs. Google's not going to use NATs. It's just going to be like this worst common denominator. No one's going to want to use it, but then we still have to maintain it. And now it's no longer just this generic pub/sub stuff. Like, I mean, a normal user, like on a single cluster, non-central Istio-D, they don't need NATs at all, right? They just look at Istio-D directly.
So let me ask.
No, that will not be the way that things work moving forward. All debugging happens over XDS, and all XDS happens over the load balancer, right? There is no connecting to Istio-D on a backdoor. That's going away.
So if there's only one Istio-D pod, there's no need for any sharing. If there's two Istio-D pods hidden behind a single endpoint, the client can't choose which one to connect to. So the two pods are supposed to be able to exchange enough information so that no matter which pod clients get, they get the same answer. So I have not read this document. Next time, can there be a picture so that I would know exactly what pieces would be needed and which ones the users would have to put in themselves?
Yep. Yeah,
I've heard
the diagram.
I've heard about Kubernetes events and config maps and NATs and message passing and stuff. So, and I don't know about performance or any of that stuff. It'd be great to know, to be able to offer a reasonable opinion without having to be an expert in all those things.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I can add a diagram to help with that. John, to your question about having this as a plugin, none of the other plugins are required for the operation of Istio, right? You can run Istio without recording telemetry data. You can run Istio without having Grafana or Kiali present, and Istio will work just fine. In terms of debugging Istio, Istio will not work without some implementation of a message bus present.
So I will say, if the design is saying that NATs is now a core dependency of Istio, we have failed. That is just not an acceptable dependency, in my opinion.
So what makes a dependency acceptable? Do you have an alternative proposal?
Yeah, like Kubernetes events are just a generic API that can be plugged into. Like, depending on NATs, that's a huge project on its own. We have a direct code dependency on it. That seems very, very concerning to me.
Okay, so there are a number of cloud events implementers. If you feel that another one could be embedded into the project, I would welcome a counter proposal. This is the only one implemented in Golang, so I don't see a path towards that, but you see it.
I don't think it's the burdens on myself to provide a new design. I think it's fair to say that the current design is not appropriate and expect that we can hopefully iterate on a new one.
So
that's reasonable.
Mitch, I want to point out that the debugging API doesn't need to be correct or fast. So if one Istio-D picks up 3 clients and then a few milliseconds later the other one is asked, tell me about clients, and it returns an answer that's 5 seconds old, it's no big deal. I would go for the easiest one, given that the control plane is simply running as a process, maybe in Kubernetes. How can they just share enough information to get us up and limping with a debug troubleshooting API?
Yeah, that is the goal of this design.
Okay. I will go back and read about NATs and understand why John hates it, and then we can move forward.
Sounds good.
Okay, I think we've reached the top of the hour. So next week we will talk about we will return to organizing the commands and breaking things apart based on personas and if you're a cloud provider or not. Thank you, everyone. Have a good holiday.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, team.